Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Mafia and Gangsters video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's do another random entry here. Once again focusing on a lesser known mobster, but even though this guy wasn't necessarily a household name, when I was reading this information about him, and then what essentially you're going to see here in the next few minutes, you'll see that there was pretty much no low end point when it came to this guy's sadistic and violent activities. I mean, when I was reading this info, it was shocking to see what this guy did to the people that loved him, to people that were around him. It makes you wonder if he was doing that to the people closest to him. You could just imagine what he would do to total strangers or people that he ended up hating. This was definitely a very, very bad guy, a very sadistic guy, somebody that ironically, despite all of his violent activities, actually almost ended up dying peacefully later on in his life. Even though it was done in obscurity, he still almost had that kind of peaceful ending to his life, despite everything he did before. But you're looking at a picture of him now, you can easily see why he just looked bad. Like, this was one guy that you did not want to cross. His full name was Michael Coppola. But as always, there were nicknames associated with these mobsters, and in his case, it was fittingly called Trigger Mike. And obviously, you'll see why in a few minutes he had that name because of his short temperament and his very, very violent tendencies. So let's go ahead and let's talk about all the information associated with this very, very sadistic gangster. So who was this Michael Coppola, aka Trigger Mike? Well, he was someone that was born back in New York City, back on July 2nd, 1900. So how about that? He was born pretty much at the start of that new century. And this was a guy that born in New York City, nobody really knew much about his younger years, as far as, let's say, his childhood years, teens, and so on. It seems like I say that a lot with some of my other videos too. It's fascinating how so much of this stuff is just almost lost into obscurity. It's not until these mobsters, let's say, more adult years, that things start getting chronicled. But what is known is that he was born to the parents, a father by the name of Giuseppe and a mother by the name of Angelina, and then he also had some siblings as well, 8 of them, if I'm not mistaken. So you can see that was a very, very large family. But despite not having much information about his younger years, what is known is that sometime during the Prohibition era, that's essentially when he started to work in the New York Mafia. That's essentially when he started blossoming when it comes to his activities. And he was someone that actually enjoyed, almost seemingly enjoyed, everything that was happening with Prohibition. Prohibition was that unique era. I mentioned that in some of my past videos as well, where it seems like it was making or breaking mobsters. This was definitely the time period where lots of mafia members could excel, gain a lot of power, and then of course others were losing power during the meantime, and it created those infamous clashes between multiple mafia families. And this is where this guy, Trigger Mike, essentially earned his reputation. That's why he was called Trigger Mike, because he was considered a, quote, sadistic and violent gunman. This was definitely someone who was not hesitant to commit murders, who was not hesitant to take action or take on hits, especially when it came to working for the family he was working for and making sure that they could help consolidate power. In fact, the family he was working for was actually Lucky Luciano's family, and throughout that time period and the excelling done by that family, he was able to become a high-ranking member. And so much so, in fact, that eventually the Lucky Luciano, once he faced his own conviction, and then there was an underboss that fled the country, this guy, Trigger Mike, actually became almost like in charge of the Luciano crime family, and he helped operate so many of those criminal operations. They included, of course, numbers rackets, they included gambling, they included prostitution, they included bribery. He also helped control several of the unions that were there as well. And then, of course, anything involving violent actions up to including murder. He was definitely someone that was involved in those things too. So this was, again, a person that grew within the Prohibition era, solidified his reputation as a very, very violent person, and then then was able to use it to get higher ranking powers until he was almost practically running that place. But what ended up happening was his personal life ended up being almost like his downfall. And here's what I mean, and here's where it goes into the more sadistic side associated with this guy. His first wife was a lady by the name of Doris Lehman, and they ended up marrying back in 1943. But as it turns out, she ended up dying, and she wasn't dying, let's say, of natural causes. No, in her case, she was actually murdered. And the reason why she was murdered was because it turns out she overheard Trigger Mike's plans to to do something in terms of kidnapping and assassinating some New York Republican Party activist, a guy by the name of Joseph Scotorigio. Hope I'm saying that name correctly, Joseph Scotorigio, because of the, item that was going through as far as some kind of vote. There was some opposing party, and they wanted to make sure that this guy, Joseph Scotorigio, would not have a successful party. But as it turns out, she overheard those plans, and here's what he did. Here's what Trigger Mike did. On the day after she gave birth, keep that in mind, she just gave birth to a new baby. The day after, he ended up killing her. He reportedly killed her to make sure that she would not testify against him. Well, I don't know. I don't have the information, and I don't know how he knew. But somehow he was able to learn that she was going to testify against him about what she heard with regards to that stuff, the assassination associated with Joseph Scotorigio. She heard it. He somehow knew she heard it. And so he killed her again the day after she gave birth to a new child, which is presumably their child. Can you imagine that? When it comes to this type of action, something like that would just make anyone shudder when it comes to the type of activity. But here was this guy easily doing this just to make sure that nothing would complicate the plan, the assassination, and then, of course, implicating him on that. Imagine that. And so, as it turns out, that's at least one really, really bad thing that he did. I'll talk about more on another one just here in a moment. But cut to a little bit later in 1960s, I don't know how, but he was able to then work in Nevada, or try to work, at least with the casinos that were there. You know how there were a lot of mobsters that were around that time period there in the casinos. He ended up being in the Black Book, the infamous Black Book that was operated there by Nevada state officials. And that's pretty interesting too, because there's only a short amount of names. Like, in other words, there's a handful, a larger amount of names, but not all of them. But still, there's a good amount of names within that book, and he ended up being one of them. At that time, there was only 11. I imagine it's a larger amount now, but he was one of those 11 people. During that same time period, he actually had another wife, and this was his second wife, a lady by the name of Ann Coppola. And then during that time period, she in turn was actually filing for divorce from him, because as it turns out, she found out that he was supplying drugs to their very own daughter. Imagine that too. His own daughter, he was somehow providing drugs directly to her. Obviously, this is just very bad activity, but what led to things next just takes it to a whole other level. She in turn was so just aghast at what was happening to their daughter, that she decided to cooperate with law enforcement and with the legal departments to make sure that she could testify against him on this income tax investigations. We've heard about those in the past with some of those mobsters, especially with Al Capone. They can get away with a lot of things, but stuff involving income tax, where they had to pay revenue on income that was obviously not declared, that's the kind of stuff that definitely gets people into trouble. And so she was going to testify against him, again, much like his very first wife, that was going to testify against him about that other activity, that bad activity that he was planning on doing. And in this case, he ordered several of his men to get his wife and Coppola to find her, severely beat her, and then leave her in some area. He ordered them to kidnap her and assault her, and they did so. They did so quite badly, in fact. Like, she was practically left almost dead on an isolated beach, but she survived. She actually ended up surviving. And so with that, she still, this poor woman, you can see the struggle that she had, but the braveness associated with it. She still, even after all this, decided to go ahead and work with law enforcement. She survived that assault. She continued working with them, and then they was finally taken to court using her information. She pretty much told them everything that she knew about his activities, everything as far as what was happening that they needed to know on tax evasions, everything like that. And Trigger Mike was found guilty. He was done in basically by those closest to him because of what that he in turn did to them. And so he was found guilty. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Unfortunately, though, Ann Coppola never really recuperated from that assault. Because of all the physical and mental abuse that she had from him during all these years, she ended up fleeing to Europe. She actually contained in whatever briefcase or whatever she had with her about $250,000 of the family's money. This was the ill-gotten money from the tax evasion. And then while she was there in Rome, Italy, she sent one letter to the IRS, again spilling everything that she knew about this guy, about Trigger Mike's illegal activities, everything happening within the Luciano crime family as well. It was almost like a death letter because, as it turns out, she ended up committing suicide by taking a large amount of sleeping pills. So very tragic case when it came to Ann Coppola, but huge kudos to her. And again, the resilience that she had, the bravery that she had, even after that big assault that almost killed her, to just continue and make sure that she could get this guy back in prison. But as it turns out, he ended up just staying again about those 4 years in prison. But if there's any resolution that works in this case, it's that once he got out of prison, his power was gone. Trigger Mike was no longer part of the family, at least when it came to the same type of hold that he had before. This was a guy that apparently was just a shadow of himself. Either nobody wanted to work with him anymore, or he was just considered almost like a black sheep. Either way, though, he just pretty much moved on and then lived out in obscurity up until his death, and that was back in 1966, just 3 years later. So he went from being almost the top of everything to now being nothing. And with that, he obviously had nobody around him, no family, no members, nothing else that I could think. I mean, who would want to be his family member, especially with what he ended up doing to his second wife? And so he died in obscurity in some general hospital there in Boston, Massachusetts, as is pretty much nothing. So again, as I mentioned at the very beginning, kind of like he died peacefully, but there's still at least that vindication that he ended up being nothing afterward. But if anybody has any more information, anything else I might have missed, then please post those comments below. What about those of you there in the Boston, Massachusetts area? Maybe if you know more information about his later years in life, especially before his death, on the local level, I'd love to hear what your stories are with regards to that. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care.